The Galactic Union had already decided. The planet was infected. 3% would survive if the rest were burned away. The fleet formed up in orbit. Mirrored hulls aligned to focus stellar fire. Sirens wailed across the surface below, not as a call for help, but as a sentence being carried out. Billions of lives had been reduced to a clean equation, efficient and merciless. And then humanity breached the quarantine. No weapons, no protective seals. They removed their helmets and breathed the poisoned air, because they believed you cannot treat children through glass. For the first time in recorded history, the galaxy witnessed a species willing to die from disease, not to win, not to conquer, but so that no one would face the end alone. What followed broke every law the universe believed it understood. The conclave of species watched the infected world from the cold geometry of orbit, where emotion thinned and certainty hardened into law. Vast sensor arrays drank in data without blinking, translating chaos into graphs and spectra that scrolled across translucent panels. The atmosphere below churned in sickly layers, spore clouds so dense they bent incoming sunlight into jaundiced rings that crawled across the planet as surface like bruises. From space, the air itself looked diseased, breathing in slow, convulsive pulses that registered as cascading biofailure across every analytical model. The world had once sung with movement. Oceans had flashed with bioluminescent tides, forests had exhaled complex chemical perfumes, cities had hummed with heat and industry. Now the dominant sounds were emergency sirens echoing through thinning air and the faint, constant hiss of containment fields struggling to hold back an extinction event already in motion. Population curves collapsed with ruthless elegance, lines dropping away in smooth arcs that offended no algorithm and troubled no equation. Within the conclave's doctrine, beauty often wore the mask of efficiency. According to the accumulated wisdom of dozens of civilizations, survival was not a moral question but a logistical one. The models agreed with perfect unanimity that a planetary cleansing would halt the spread beyond this system and preserve a viable remnant of life. A fraction, small but sufficient, would endure in subterranean vaults and hardened habitats. In several centuries, those survivors could reseed the biosphere, rebuilding what fire and radiation would erase. The loss of the rest was not classified as tragedy, but as expenditure. Orbital platforms adjusted their positions with ceremonial precision. Sterilization vessels unfolded mirrored petals, aligning to channel stellar output into focused beams of annihilation. Their reactors thrummed at a frequency that vibrated through vacuum-hardened hulls, a soundless promise of total erasure. Across the planet, warning systems wailed not to summon rescue, but to mark the closing of a ledger. The air carried the sharp, metallic tang of panic and decay, though no sensor could quantify the weight of it. Within the conclave chambers, representatives observed in disciplined silence. Many turned secondary visual organs away from live feeds, not out of pity, but because continued observation served no analytical purpose. Mercy, as they defined it, had already been calculated and applied. Compassion had been reduced to a percentage that balanced long-term stability against immediate loss. With a single procedural motion, the world was reclassified. Its designation shifted from inhabited to contaminated, a change logged in immaculate script and archived alongside countless others. 300 million souls vanished into abstraction, compressed into a statistic that fit comfortably within doctrine and precedent. From orbit, the planet continued to turn, unaware that it had already been pronounced dead by a galaxy that valued order above all else. The quarantine fleet locked itself into position with ritual precision, engines bleeding excess heat into the void as formation lights synchronized into flawless geometry. Sterilization vessels drifted forward like a ceremonial blade, their mirrored hulls unfolding in segmented layers that caught the nearby star and bent its radiance into disciplined lines. The reflected light grew harsh and white, bright enough to cast razor-edged shadows across neighboring ships, bright enough to sting even hardened sensor arrays. Every movement followed precedent refined over centuries of similar endings. Below them, the planet answered with sound. Sirens wailed through cities and open plains alike, their tones oscillating between frequencies meant to cut through panic and despair. They were not alarms seeking response. They were not calls for evacuation or hope. They were the formal announcement of conclusion, coded into the planet's emergency infrastructure long ago for an event no civilization ever truly believed would arrive. The air carried the vibration of those sirens through collapsing streets, through sealed habitats, through lungs already burning with infection. The quarantine fleet did not descend. It did not adjust course to assist. It simply waited, patient and immovable, as the countdown ticked forward within synchronized command cores. The vessel's internal environments smelled of antiseptic alloys and recycled air, calm and sterile in deliberate contrast to the chaos below. Crew members of a dozen species monitored the same data streams, watching atmospheric saturation levels rise and population viability curves fall with smooth inevitability. Spore clouds churned across the surface in vast, slow-moving fronts, thick enough to refract sunlight into jaundiced halos that rolled across oceans and continents. From orbit, the planet looked bruised, its weather systems distorted into 6 spirals by chemical imbalance and biological collapse. Thermal blooms flared where cities still burned fuel, then dimmed one by one as power grids failed and darkness spread like an ink stain. Within the broader conclave network, observation protocols shifted. Secondary and tertiary sensors were deactivated by many member species, their feeds rerouted to archival storage rather than active display. It was not an act of cruelty as they understood it, but one of efficiency. Recording the final hours of a condemned world served no operational purpose once the decision had been reached. Resources, even observational attention, were not to be wasted. The doctrine that governed these actions had been forged in eras of unchecked expansion and catastrophic mistakes. Entire sectors had once fallen to uncontrolled contagion because hesitation had been mistaken for compassion. Since then, the Union's guiding principle had hardened into something cold and exacting. Mercy was defined as minimizing total loss across time. Compassion was expressed through rapid, decisive action that prevented greater suffering elsewhere. The sacrifice of one world to save many was not tragedy within this framework. It was responsibility. The sterilization vessels began final alignment procedures. Their mirrored surfaces adjusted by fractions of degrees, responding to microvariations in stellar output and gravitational drift. Inside their cores, containment fields tightened around conduits designed to channel stellar fire with surgical focus. The ships hummed with restrained power, a vibration felt through hull plating and into the bones of their crews. It was the sound of an ending prepared with care. On the planet, the sirens blended with other noises. The crack of distant structural collapse echoed through empty streets. The wind carried the sour, organic stench of decay mixed with industrial smoke. Emergency lights flickered in hospitals where systems strained to keep filtration running just a little longer. In sealed shelters, the air grew stale and warm, heavy with breath and fear. Above it all, the sky burned with reflected light from the fleet, an artificial dawn that never quite rose. Some conclave species maintained full observation despite the futility. Their cultural histories demanded witness even when intervention was impossible. They cataloged the final atmospheric readings, the last transmissions from surface networks before static consumed them, the precise moment when population models crossed thresholds of irreversibility. These records would be used in future deliberations, cited as evidence that the protocol functioned as intended. Others turned inward, focusing on procedural checklists and internal rhythms to avoid the distraction of empathy. Their nervous systems were ill-suited to prolonged exposure to mass death, and doctrine allowed them this distance. The Union did not require emotional endurance, only compliance. As the countdown neared its final phase, the fleet's formation tightened further. Navigation thrusters fired in silent bursts, correcting minute deviations. The vessels appeared less like a collection of ships and more like a single, colossal mechanism suspended above the planet, every component locked into place. The star's light intensified across the mirrored hulls, creating a blinding lattice that dominated the orbital sky. From this vantage, the planet's surface seemed small. Its oceans were shallow bowls of darkened water. Its continents were textured scars. Its atmosphere, once a complex system of living exchange, now registered as a failing barrier. The remaining inhabitants were invisible at this scale, reduced to heat signatures and probability distributions. Their fear, their hope, their final moments existed only as noise beneath the data. The Conclave's automated systems prepared to execute the cleansing sequence. Authorization codes cascaded through secure channels, verified and re-verified by independent logic cores. No dissent registered within acceptable parameters. The Union's will was unanimous in its certainty. To those who observed, this was what justice looked like on a galactic scale. Clean, orderly, final, a necessary excision to preserve the greater body. The sirens below continued to wail, thin and desperate, their sound lost to vacuum long before it could reach the waiting fleet. The moment stretched, heavy with anticipation yet devoid of doubt. Stellar fire waited to be released, and with it the promise that suffering would end swiftly, efficiently, and forever. Human vessels tore through the outer quarantine perimeter without acknowledgement or delay, their drives shrieking as interdiction fields scraped against hull plating like claws against bone. The sound translated across sensor arrays as violent distortion, a raw scream of energy that had no place in the Conclave's carefully choreographed silence. Automated warnings flared and died unanswered as the ships forced their way inward, engines burning hotter rather than yielding to containment protocols designed to stop wars, not mercy. Observers across the quarantine fleet registered immediate confusion. The incoming craft carried no weapon signatures, no shield harmonics associated with assault formations. Instead, their hulls were marked with unfamiliar iconography rendered in stark, high-contrast pigments. Human medical insignia broadcast openly on every frequency. The symbols were not hidden or encrypted. They were declarations, bright against scorched metal, visible even to the naked eye through optical magnification. No attempt was made to mask intent. The vessels did not slow as they crossed into lethal atmospheric gradients. Landing craft detached in disciplined waves and plunged toward the surface, ignoring vectors that would have carried them to safer altitudes or peripheral zones. Their descent paths cut directly into the densest concentrations of airborne spores, into skies already choked and discolored by biological collapse. External hull temperatures spiked as corrosive particulates scraped against plating, leaving luminous trails that marked their passage like falling stars aimed at extinction. Within the quarantine fleet, reaction lagged behind comprehension. This behavior fit no existing profile. No species documented in the Conclave archives had ever breached an active sterilization cordon for a world already marked for cleansing. Rescue operations were only attempted before classification, never after. The humans had arrived too late by every accepted measure, and yet they came anyway, accelerating rather than hesitating as environmental readings worsened. The first landing zones bloomed with displaced air and ash as human craft touched down amid failing cities. Streets buckled beneath unfamiliar weight. Structures already weakened by neglect and panic shuddered as engines cut and ramps lowered. What followed defied every expectation recorded by the watching species. The humans emerged without environmental seals. Helmets were removed and discarded immediately, tossed aside onto contaminated ground without ceremony. Bare skin met poisoned air in a silent act of defiance, so complete it briefly disrupted sensor interpretation, as if the machines themselves refused to believe what they were recording. The atmosphere assaulted them at once. Spores clung to hair and fabric, coating exposed flesh in fine, iridescent dust. The air burned on inhalation, carrying a bitter, organic tang that scorched lungs and eyes. Human breathing became ragged within moments, chests heaving as foreign pathogens found hosts that offered no resistance beyond fragile immune systems. Still, the humans advanced, movements deliberate and purposeful despite visible distress. Portable containment fields remained inactive. No isolation barriers flared into place. Medical drones stayed grounded. The humans moved directly into shelters, clinics, and collapsed transit hubs, stepping over warning glyphs and hazard markers that screamed of certain death. Their actions suggested a belief that distance itself was a form of cruelty, that treating the afflicted through layers of shielding transformed care into observation and observation into abandonment. To them, protection that prevented touch was indistinguishable from refusal. Within interior spaces, the sensory environment shifted violently. The metallic reek of failing machinery mixed with the sweet rot of infection. Emergency lighting flickered in erratic pulses, painting human figures in harsh reds and sickly greens as they crossed rooms thick with coughs and labored breaths. Hands reached out from shadows, trembling, clawing at fabric and exposed skin alike. The humans did not retreat from contact. They leaned into it, lifting bodies slick with fever, pressing faces close enough to feel breath against cheek. From orbit, the conclave watched infection vectors explode outward in real time. Human biosignatures flared across tactical displays as contamination spread faster than any previous model had predicted. Mortality projections recalculated again and again, each iteration more catastrophic for the newcomers. Yet alongside those grim curves appeared something unprecedented. Native survival rates, which had been collapsing toward inevitability, began to stabilize in scattered pockets wherever human presence concentrated. The contradiction strained analytical frameworks. The humans were increasing total infection load while simultaneously reducing localized fatality. They were, by every measurable standard, making the situation worse for themselves in order to make it marginally better for others. The concept did not resolve into any known optimization strategy. It violated principles that underpinned the quarantine doctrine itself. Human ships continued to arrive, not in overwhelming numbers, but steadily, relentlessly, as if answering a call that could not be ignored. Their hulls bore scars from previous conflicts and long service, patched and repainted rather than replaced. Many carried civilian registries repurposed for emergency response. Cargo holds disgorged supplies not rated for the toxicity below, yet used regardless. Improvisation replaced protocol with unsettling efficiency. Within hours, human casualty markers flooded shared space. Bodies failed and were carried out or laid gently against walls, eyes dimming even as hands remained outstretched. The living did not stop to mourn. They stepped over the fallen with visible strain, continuing forward because stopping meant leaving someone else alone. Sensors recorded tremors in human musculature, microspasms of pain and exhaustion overridden by momentum that seemed to come from somewhere other than biology. The quarantine fleet's sterilization vessels held position, their mirrors still aligned, stellar fires still contained. No override was issued. No new command could account for what was unfolding below. The humans had not come to argue doctrine or demand reprieve. They had simply entered the dying world and begun to share its fate. Across the planet, sirens continued to wail, but their sound was joined now by other noises. Human-made rhythms emerged amid the chaos, the thud of boots, the scrape of stretchers across broken flooring, the wet rasp of breath drawn by lungs fighting unfamiliar enemies. These sounds carried no strategic value, yet they filled the air with something the conclave had no terminology for. For the first time since the quarantine began, the planet was not facing extinction alone. The infection took the humans almost immediately, without negotiation or delay, as if the alien pathogens recognized fresh territory and surged to claim it. Lungs burned with every breath, airways swelling and filling with fluid that tasted of metal and rot. Skin mottled beneath drifting spore dust, pores becoming entry points for microscopic invaders that rewrote cellular behavior with ruthless efficiency. Sensors tracked the change in human physiology in real time, red indicators blooming across medical readouts faster than automated systems could adapt. Yet the humans did not withdraw. They moved deeper into the collapsing infrastructure, through hospitals that reeked of antiseptic failure and organic decay, through shelters where recycled air had grown thick and warm with fear. Their breathing grew harsher, shoulders hitching with suppressed coughs, but their hands remained steady. They lifted the weak with practiced care, muscles trembling under unfamiliar weight, eyes fixed on faces rather than flickering monitors that offered probabilities instead of comfort. Children were gathered first, small bodies slick with fever and trembling with exhaustion. Instead of sealing them into isolation pods, the humans drew them close, wrapping arms around fragile frames as if warmth itself were a weapon. Tiny hands clutched at human fabric and skin, leaving smears of contamination that no one attempted to wipe away. Heartbeats pressed together, erratic rhythms synchronizing in moments of shared breath. The Conclave's sensors registered a spike in cross-species bioexchange so severe that predictive models temporarily failed to converge. Elders came next, beings whose bodies had already begun the slow surrender to systemic collapse. Humans lowered themselves beside them on stained floors and narrow cots, cradling brittle forms as fever surged and broke in violent waves. Fingers traced cooling limbs, anchoring minds that had drifted toward acceptance. Where isolation protocols would have demanded separation, the humans offered presence, remaining still even as tremors racked their own frames and blood flecked their lips. The hospitals became soundscapes of collision. Sirens wailed from external systems still clinging to function, their tones overlapping in dissonant layers that scraped against the nerves. Beneath them rose human-made rhythms, uneven but relentless. The thud of boots against cracked flooring, the scrape of stretchers dragged by exhausted hands, the wet rasp of shared breathing in air that refused to be clean. There was no silence left anywhere on the planet. From orbit, the Conclave watched order dissolve into motion. Triage patterns emerged where none should have existed, driven not by centralized command, but by instinct and experience etched into human movement. The newcomers clustered around the worst-hit zones, drawing the infection toward themselves with proximity alone. Mortality projections spiked for the humans with terrifying speed, while native survival curves hesitated, flattening in places they had already been expected to vanish. The contradiction deepened as hours stretched into an indistinct blur. Human immune systems failed spectacularly and then, inexplicably, adapted in isolated cases, producing responses that slowed pathogen spread just long enough to matter. Even when adaptation failed, the time gained allowed others to stabilize. The cost was obscene. Human bodies collapsed mid-stride, knees buckling, hands still reaching. Those who fell were moved gently aside, never abandoned, but no longer the priority, while someone else still breathed. The smell inside the shelters grew overwhelming. Sweet decay mingled with the sharp tang of bodily fluids and the acrid smoke of overheated machinery. Sweat soaked human clothing, carrying foreign spores deeper into fabric and skin. Eyes burned constantly, tears streaking faces in tracks that cut through grime and dust. Still, the humans continued to touch, to hold, to lift, to stay. The Conclave's observation chambers filled with cascading alerts. Protocol violations multiplied beyond categorization. Quarantine doctrine unraveled in the face of data that refused to align with precedent. No species had ever willingly increased its own casualty rate to reduce another's suffering by such a narrow margin. No recorded civilization had ever chosen to collapse alongside a dying world rather than preserve itself at a distance. As the infection progressed, human movement slowed but did not stop. Coughs deepened into convulsions that bent spines and left bodies shaking, yet arms tightened rather than loosened. In one shelter, a human collapsed against a wall, breath hitching in wet gasps, only to push upright moments later to support an elder whose fever had spiked anew. In another, a human lay still on the floor while a child slept curled against their chest, breathing steady for the first time in days. From orbit, sensors registered the human dead accumulating in clusters that mirrored their living formations. They fell where they worked, where they knelt, where they held others. There was no orderly retreat, no extraction attempt once conditions worsened. Replacement teams arrived and joined the same lethal dance, stepping into the spaces left by those who could no longer stand. The Conclave attempted recalibration. New models were spun, factoring in human behavior as a variable rather than an anomaly. Every simulation fractured under the weight of it. The humans were not acting to win, not acting to preserve numbers or territory or future leverage. They were acting to ensure that, in the final accounting, no one would face the end alone. As days blurred together, the sirens outside faltered, power systems failing one by one. In their absence, the human rhythms grew louder, filling the vacuum left by collapsing infrastructure. Breathing, coughing, whispered reassurances that carried no semantic meaning to alien ears yet registered as stabilizing patterns in neural scans. Touch became the dominant form of communication, pressure and warmth conveying what language could not. The infection burned through human populations with merciless speed. Entire teams vanished within short spans of time, their absence immediately felt and filled by others who moved forward without hesitation. Grief registered only as momentary slowing, a brief stillness before motion resumed. The humans did not allow themselves the luxury of stopping. From the Conclave's vantage, the planet no longer resembled a controlled extinction event. It looked like chaos given form, a seething mass of suffering and defiance intertwined so tightly they became indistinguishable. Protocols designed to categorize and contain could no longer track cause and effect with confidence. What remained undeniable was this: where humans were present, the dying did not die unseen. The infection took them, broke them, consumed them, yet in doing so it encountered a species that refused isolation as a solution. The galaxy had engineered countless clean endings. On this world, for the first time, it was witnessing a messy, agonizing resistance built not from weapons or shields, but from hands that would not let go. Casualty projections began to unravel as soon as the new data streams were folded into the Union's logic engines. Lines that had once curved with comforting predictability twisted into erratic spirals, rising and falling in defiance of established probability law. Human mortality climbed with brutal speed, bodies failing in clusters wherever proximity and care overlapped. At the same time, local survival rates rose in pockets that should have gone dark hours earlier. The graphs began to mirror one another, a grotesque symmetry in which one population's decline fed another's persistence. The processing cores strained under the contradiction. Their vast crystalline matrices hummed with escalating intensity, heat bleeding into containment housings as recursive models attempted to reconcile the impossible premise. Volunteers were behaving as liabilities by every metric the Union had ever codified. They knowingly reduced their own chances, stepping into higher exposure zones, extending contact times far beyond safe thresholds, lingering where retreat would have preserved operational capacity. Yet each irrational act nudged the survival curves of strangers upward by fractions that compounded into something undeniable. The air inside the conclave chambers thickened with the scent of overheated alloys and ionized insulation. Visual arrays flickered as predictive overlays failed to lock, colors bleeding into one another where certainty should have existed. Representatives who had never known doubt found their sensory fronds twitching, secondary hearts stuttering as the data refused to stabilize. The models did not merely fail to converge. They contradicted the axioms upon which the Union itself had been built. On the planet below, the cost continued to mount. Human forms littered corridors and shelters, their stillness marked only by the absence of breath and the cooling of skin pressed against alien flesh. Others staggered onward, lungs shredded, vision blurred, yet driven by a momentum that no chemical stimulant could explain. Each loss should have validated the sterilization order waiting in orbit. Instead, each loss distorted the equation further, introducing variables labeled sacrifice, presence, and refusal to abandon. The sterilization fleet held position, mirrored hulls already aligned, stellar fire waiting behind disciplined containment fields. Countdown sequences had been initiated cycles earlier, their silent progress marked by diminishing margins on command displays. Every system reported readiness. Energy reserves were optimal. Firing solutions were pristine. Nothing mechanical stood in the way of annihilation. The moment the final thresholds expired, the command to fire did not come. It was not delayed by sabotage or error. No circuit failed. No signal was lost in transmission. The paralysis settled into the fleet like a held breath, an absence where action should have been. Command authorities cycled priorities, reissued confirmations, and found themselves looping through justification subroutines that no longer produced authorization. The logic engines returned inconclusive flags, citing unresolved variables with unprecedented frequency. Those variables streamed in relentlessly. Visual feeds showed humans collapsing beside those they had been supporting, hands still clasped around weaker forms. Thermal scans revealed shared warmth lingering long after human heartbeats ceased, slowing hypothermic shock in alien bodies by measurable margins. Neurological telemetry detected reduced panic responses in populations surrounded by humans, fear dampened by proximity even as infection markers spiked. The Union had always defined mercy as efficiency. Compassion had been a calculation, a cold allowance carved into extermination protocols to preserve long-term stability. What unfolded now did not fit inside those definitions. A civilization was choosing shared suffering over optimized survival, distributing pain as deliberately as the Union distributed death. They were not maximizing outcome. They were equalizing experience. As the hours stretched beyond their projected endpoints, the conclave watched despair transform. It did not vanish. It condensed. Grief and terror fused into a collective stand that radiated outward from every human cluster. The planet's emotional signatures shifted, detectable even through layers of interference and distance. Where isolated terror had once spiked erratically, there was now a sustained, resonant pattern of resolve. The logic engines attempted to quantify it. New parameters were hastily constructed, labels borrowed from anthropological archives that had once been considered cultural curiosities rather than strategic forces. Solidarity, witness, shared burden. Each parameter destabilized the models further, injecting non-zero values where null entries had been assumed universal. The watching species experienced something that had no precedent in their recorded histories. They had known martyrdom as spectacle, heroism as anomaly, altruism as controlled resource. They had never witnessed an entire operational doctrine built around the premise that no one should be left to face oblivion unseen. The humans were not posturing for legacy or reward. Their actions generated no advantage that could be claimed by their species alone. If anything, the cost threatened to cripple them for generations. And yet the effect was undeniable. Entire population clusters that had been mathematically condemned persisted past every projected termination point. Children who should have succumbed lay breathing beneath borrowed blankets, hearts steadied by rhythms not their own. Elders who had prepared for solitary ends drifted back from the edge, anchored by hands that refused to release them even as rigor crept into human fingers. The sterilization fleet's systems continued to wait, obedient and immaculate. Time became an unaccounted factor, stretching beyond its allotted place in the equations. With every passing moment, the option to fire grew heavier, not because of rising opposition, but because the act itself would now erase something more than contamination. It would erase a choice that had been made openly, willingly, and without expectation of survival. Within the conclave, silence spread. Not the procedural silence of efficient observation, but a charged stillness in which every representative processed the same impossible conclusion through the lens of their own biology. To fire now would not be mercy by any existing definition. It would be punishment, inflicted not for failure, but for defiance of despair. The Union's founding principle had always been preservation of the many at the expense of the few. Humanity had inverted the premise. They had expanded the category of the many to include anyone within reach of their arms, even when that reach shortened their own lives. In doing so, they had exposed a flaw in the Union's most sacred arithmetic. The equations had never accounted for a species that valued togetherness over continuation. As projections continued to spiral, one truth stabilized amid the chaos. The galaxy was no longer observing a quarantine event. It was witnessing a moral phenomenon, raw and unoptimized, burning brighter than any sterilization beam. A civilization was teaching the universe, without words or demands, that survival measured only in numbers was an impoverished victory. The command to fire remained unspoken. The fleet held its aim, mirrors gleaming, engines humming, suspended between doctrine and revelation. Below, humans continued to fall and to hold, to breathe and to fail, transforming a doomed world into a testament that no equation could dismiss and no precedent could erase. The infection did not end with fire or cleansing light, but with exhaustion. It burned itself thin and hollow, starved not by annihilation, but by care that denied it the easy harvest of isolated bodies. The spore clouds thinned, their sickly halos fading as sunlight reclaimed honest color. Atmospheric readings shifted from cascading failure to fragile stability, each increment a quiet victory paid for in blood, breath, and proximity. The planet remained scarred, its surface pocked with the aftermath of collapse, yet it continued to turn, alive in a way no projection had dared to allow. On the ground, the silence arrived unevenly. Sirens died first, their power reserves finally depleted, leaving behind an emptiness that rang louder than any alarm. The air carried the lingering smells of decay and antiseptic, layered with the iron tang of dried blood and the faint sweetness of recovering vegetation pushing through ash-laden soil. Shelters stood half-collapsed, hospitals gutted and dark, yet within them survivors stirred, tentative movements replacing the stillness of waiting for death. Human forms lay everywhere, their presence woven into the landscape of survival. Some rested where they had fallen, hands still outstretched, bodies arranged not by design, but by the last acts they had chosen to perform. Others breathed shallowly, alive but altered, lungs forever marked by what they had endured. Fewer humans stood than had once descended from orbit. That imbalance was recorded without embellishment, a simple accounting that carried more weight than celebration ever could. The ships that eventually rose from the surface did so without fanfare. Their hulls bore the stains of atmospheric contamination and emergency landings, paint scorched and dulled. Inside, there were no cheers, no banners, no ritual acknowledgments of success. Silence filled their corridors, broken only by the low hum of engines and the soft sounds of the living tending to the wounded. Every empty seat was a testament, every sealed compartment a name that would never be spoken aloud in that moment. Behind them, millions remained. They stood in ruined streets and open fields, wrapped in borrowed fabrics and makeshift shelters, watching the human vessels climb toward the sky. Many of them would not live to see full recovery. Many would carry the infection's legacy in damaged organs and shortened lives. Yet none of them had faced the end alone. In their final hours, those who had died had felt warmth, pressure, and presence. They had been seen. From orbit, the conclave observed the retreat in stunned quiet. The sterilization fleet powered down its weapons, mirrored hulls folding back into neutral configurations that suddenly looked archaic. Data streams stabilized at last, casualty projections resolving into final figures that defied earlier doctrine. Survival had been achieved without planetary cleansing. Containment had succeeded without extermination. The cost had been catastrophic and deliberate, borne almost entirely by volunteers who had no claim to the world they had saved. Within the conclave chambers, doctrine revision began without ceremony. The language was careful, restrained, as if the authors feared that excessive emphasis might fracture the institutional voice. Amendments were logged, footnotes expanded into clauses, assumptions quietly retired. The date of the event was recorded not as a victory or failure, but as a turning point, the moment when established definitions proved insufficient. Strength was rewritten. No longer was it solely the capacity to endure longest or to preserve the greatest number at the least expense. A new definition emerged, tentative at first, then solidified by the sheer weight of evidence. Strength was the willingness to share suffering when avoidance was possible. It was the refusal to let life end unseen, unheard, or untouched, even when observation alone would have guaranteed survival. The conclave archives struggled to classify the human action. It was not altruism as previously cataloged, not martyrdom, not calculated risk. It was something more pervasive, a systemic trait that manifested across individuals without centralized command. Humanity had not acted as a hive or a machine. It had acted as a multitude, making the same choice for reasons that could not be reduced to logic alone. Across the galaxy, the record spread. Species that had once turned sensors away now studied every frame of archived footage. Analysts replayed moments of contact slowed to fractional time, examining how touch altered physiological outcomes, how presence dampened panic responses, how shared breathing synchronized heart rates across species barriers. Entire academic disciplines shifted focus, grappling with implications that threatened to upend quarantine law across known space. On the planet itself, life resumed its fragile insistence. Fires were extinguished. Fields were cleared of bodies with reverence rather than efficiency. Memorials rose not as towering monuments, but as small markers placed where humans had fallen, stones stacked by hands that still trembled. Each marker represented someone who had chosen to stand where logic said they should flee. The infection was gone, its genetic signatures breaking apart under immune pressure and environmental collapse. What remained was a world altered in ways no sensor could fully quantify. Trust lingered in the air alongside grief. Survivors spoke of the humans not as saviors, but as companions in suffering, a distinction that carried profound weight. They had not been rescued from above. They had been met where they stood. In the Conclave's final report, a single line drew more attention than any statistic. It stated that humanity had demonstrated a form of resilience that could not be measured in survival percentages alone. This resilience did not harden against loss. It absorbed it, redistributed it, and transformed despair into collective endurance. The galaxy did not become gentler overnight. Quarantine protocols remained. Sterilization fleets continued to exist. Logic still governed most decisions. Yet something irreversible had shifted. There was now a precedent that could not be erased, a recorded truth that would surface whenever cold mathematics threatened to eclipse lived experience. Humanity returned to its own space diminished in number and burdened by memory. Their ships carried silence, but also something heavier and more enduring. They carried proof that meaning could be forged in the act of staying, that courage could be expressed not through conquest or survival alone, but through the stubborn insistence that no one should face oblivion in isolation. The world they left behind turned once more beneath its star, wounded yet breathing. Its people rebuilt among scars that would never fully fade, each one a reminder of the day strangers arrived without armor and chose to fall beside them. In that shared suffering, the galaxy had learned a new definition of strength, and humanity had written it not with fire, but with hands that refused to let go.